I find that many HR managers, at least the ones that I've seen in action, aren't comfortable telling someone anything negative. They don't want a negative reaction. So they'd rather just kind of push it off rather than being upfront and honest. If you've ever sat in front of an HR manager when you are being interviewed, you kind of wonder sometimes, at least I know back in the day when I was interviewing, I'd wonder, what is that HR manager really thinking when they're interviewing me? Well, today what we're going to do is we're going to answer that question. I've got Joric McLean. Joric is a former HR manager for the Phoenix Suns. Joric is also a manager, was a HR director for just over 20 years. So Joric's got a ton of experience when it comes to HR. And if there's any question that I want to know, and I think you probably want to know too, is what is that HR manager thinking when they're sitting across from us? Joric, I want to welcome you here to Over 50 TV.
Hey, thanks again for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, Joric, I really am too, because that is something that does come up quite often from our viewers. They'll write me and ask a question or two or three about HR managers. And quite often I can answer the question because, as you know, I've interviewed quite a few people in my career, but I don't have your experience, Joric. And that is why I'm so happy to have you here with us today. So give us an idea when when a person is being interviewed, they're sitting across from an HR manager. Give us some feedback. Take us behind, as I always say, take us behind the HR curtain.
So from a high level standpoint, what I'm paying attention to and what I believe peers are looking at and former colleagues, body language. So not just dress, but your appearance, what you are saying, what you're not saying. Those are things that I am kind of looking for. And as you're giving answers to questions, does that fit with what the job is? Does that fit with the company? Those are in general what I'm looking for. Do you look the part? Do you sound like you're the part? Mm-hmm. And then if those are the case, then you get moved on to the offer to be a part of the part, if you will.
What if an HR manager doesn't ask you about your compensation? I mean, most of the time I know when I'm sitting across from someone, I'm interviewing them, I might say, well, what do you expect? What if they never ask you that question?
That is a clear sign that they're not interested. And whether it be the HR person in general or the company, or someone has said, hey, we're not going to move on with this candidate before the HR person even goes into the interview, because that's not something that's just going to slip the HR manager's mind. That's going to be at the top of everybody's mind. It's kind of the elephant in the room, if you will. So if you are in an interview and it's the expectation, it's the hiring interview or it's the offer interview, and you don't hear anything and there's no conversation about it, that should tell you, okay, I'm not getting a call back, or there's not like one more process to this.
Yeah.
I'll get the letter in a week or two, or the email saying, thanks so much for applying, but we're moving on to someone else, or we chose another candidate.
But what if you're in the interview? Okay, they don't ask you about salary, but then they also don't say, this is the next step. They just sort of stand up, reach their hand out, shake your hand. They never mention that second step. What does that tell you as a person who's being interviewed?
Pretty much the same as number one. That should also be a pretty clear sign that there's not going to be any other steps. This is the last conversation that's going to be had about the potential job. Unfortunately, when it's up to the candidate to ask those questions, hey, I thought we were going to talk about salary, or hey, what's the next step? That is something that it spells doom. It means that you need to keep searching for another job, because it's, I would say, really uncommon or rare for there to be another next step if the person you're speaking to doesn't talk about the next step.
Yeah. And that really leads me to something else that I know has happened to me anyway. I'm interviewing somebody. I know almost immediately that they are not a good fit, and I cut that interview short after 10 or 15 minutes. Does that tell a person who's being interviewed? Does that tell that person, hey, they're not interested, they're getting me out of here as fast as they can, they're pushing me out?
Yeah, I would say that without question, with the exception of I can think of a couple of exceptions. If it's a phone screening, depending on what the role is, it may be a cursory conversation. If it's literally a first job, you're going to work at a shop, a restaurant in high school, and it's your first
Mhm.
gig, it might be a 10 or 15-minute conversation, and then there's a hire. But for all of us that are over 50 that have had a long career or several tracks of careers, the expectation should be that that conversation is going to be at least an hour or more. So if it's a short conversation and there aren't many questions being asked of you as the
Yeah,
candidate, that's something that you're probably already programmed going, okay, I'm going to ask the recruiter or HR person more questions than they're asking me, and they're already kind of trying to wrap up. That means that they're not interested. They have another candidate in mind, or for whatever reason, they shouldn't have even had the conversation with you, because if they're only
Mhm.
going to take 10 or 15 minutes, that's a waste of your time having to get to that position, that place. And then it's
Yeah.
also a waste for their time. But sometimes that happens. But that's also a clear sign that says that, yeah, it's not going any further, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah, and I read it that way. But I think there could be, or probably as many times, that somebody who's hungry for a job isn't going to read it that way. Here's another one for you though, and this happened to me at least twice in my early career. I went to a job interview. I thought I did great. I thought I was really good. I thought I was the best candidate. And you know what happens? The HR manager looks at me and says, "Well, Lou, we've got a lot of interest in this position. We've got a lot of interviews scheduled. So that's where we're at." And I always read that as they don't want me. If they thought I was that great, they wouldn't be kind of like telling me, "Hey, you've got to be patient," or they're not even telling me what the next step is. Do you read it that way too?
I would say in that case, it's a maybe, maybe not.
Hmm.
Maybe in the standpoint of you should have some clear and concise direction over what the next steps are, for sure. But you may be, I've done this, so I don't want to be hypocritical. I've done it as a manager. I've done it
Hmm.
as a director. You may be my favorite. So,
Yeah.
but I know somebody else that we interviewed yesterday is somebody else's favorite. And we might have to come down to 3 or 4 people. So, legitimately, it may not just be, we've got too many people. It may be there's certain interest from certain places, and it's almost like you're hedging your bet. People have to go in a room and actually argue or fight for a particular person. But in
Yeah.
many cases, when I would say the majority of the time when I've used that line and I've used those exact phrases, it's a way of saying I'm not interested. It's almost a way of trying to let you down easy,
Hmm.
to almost prepping you for that letter or email that's coming going, hey,
Oh
thanks
yeah.
again for applying, but we're not interested.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said it's almost like prepping. I find often, at least what I've seen with HR managers is, and I know you're a former HR manager, so hopefully you won't be offended by this, but I find that many HR managers, at least ones that I've seen in action, aren't comfortable telling someone anything negative. They don't want a negative reaction, so they rather just kind of push it off rather than being upfront and honest. And I don't think that's a good thing for the person who's really hoping to get that job.
I completely agree with that. And it's something that in 99% of the conversations or interviews I've had, it was a complete stranger, with the exception of,
Yeah.
let's say it was a friend or someone. So I don't know this person. So it should be fairly easy to have a straightforward and honest conversation about
Mhm.
where the next steps are. Yeah, I would say that but many people have told me, even colleagues and former
Uh-huh.
colleagues, that they felt uncomfortable saying anything negative, and it was easier for them. And I think this is more passive aggressive, which is something that I have a lot of problems with my former industry, as I've shared with you off camera. And one of them is being passive aggressive and not being direct with you during that conversation. But then it's easy for me to just send the email later, hey, sorry, Lou, we're interested in somebody else, and I'm crossing my fingers that you don't call and ask, so what could I have done differently to get the job? It's unfortunate, but there are a number of people that I know that prefer that way, which I will say, I think it's a weaselly way of doing it, but people do it.
Now let's flip the page here just a little bit as they start talking or trying to talk you into that position. what does that mean? And it's pretty obvious what you're going to say, but coming from an HR manager with lots of experience, they start selling you. What are they really saying?
I would say that I want to find a way to make you an offer at the end of this job to where you're going to say yes before you leave my office, because I don't want you to go next door or down the road or the next town over. There's something that is, or either I feel that, or I've been given instruction by the person that's ultimately who you're going to work for in your department or whatever, that says, I want this person, get them. Don't let them leave without getting an offer or getting a yes out of them.
Well, Joric, I really appreciate your sitting down with us here today. Once again, I do appreciate it, because I think this is an important question or the questions to ask, which is, what's that HR manager really thinking? And speaking of what the HR manager is really thinking, I want to mention something that we haven't mentioned in the past here, is you do have your own YouTube channel. It's called Joric McLean. And I spelled your name wrong in the very beginning, but your last name is McLean, correct?
Yeah, you got it. And just for people that want something lighthearted, so it's not work related, it's not HR related, it's about travel. We live overseas in Portugal now, so I tell people about what it's like to be here, how to get here, but also what it's like to be in the world that we're living in. So it's lighthearted. It's a departure from what I've done, but it's what I'll say my next 20 to 25 years in business is going to be around the travel side of things. So it'll be hopefully more happy people that see me versus people that remember me from my HR days, which were not always, let's say, fun and happy, joy for people that I worked with, unfortunately.
Well, I think anybody watching this video, I think most anybody watching this video is going to say, well, HR people normally aren't considered your buddy. It's not to say that there aren't some pretty good HR people that can be helpful, but I do know you've been very helpful today, Joric, and I want to thank you once again for being on Over 50 TV.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much. I love to be in here.